As television was slowly but surely becoming the dominant means of communication and entertainment in the world during the 50s and 60s, movie studios had to find ways to lure people back into the cinemas and give them an experience they simply couldn't enjoy at home. The answer? Big, lavish action epics based on famous myths, Bible stories, and even novels, photographed in ridiculous widescreen formats like CinemaScope and Super Panavision, which of course meant ludicrously sized screens, and littered with big-name actors in just about every single part, no matter how small. One film that defined this entire era of cinematic spectacle was the seminal David Lean film Lawrence of Arabia, starring a young Peter O'Toole as the British military officer who built an entire army out of disparate Arab tribes to bring down the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The film, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was a critical and commercial smash, so it figures that Columbia would try to strike gold twice with another big period adventure starring O'Toole and helmed by another critical darling, director Richard Brooks. But while Lawrence was a towering masterpiece of all things cinema even back then, Lord Jim was positively slaughtered upon release and did absolutely dismal business at the box office. So, what went wrong here? Surely everything was in place, right? Based on Joseph Conrad's famous novel, Jim is a merchant sailor in Southeast Asia who ends up abandoning a passenger ship during a violent storm. When the ship arrives safely at port, he is tried and disgraced before his naval peers for cowardice. At a complete loss, he becomes a gun runner and aids a group of Petusian natives against a mad warlord and his men. Right from the get-go, Brooks gives Lord Jim the full-blown widescreen adventure treatment. The film, frankly, looks terrific, with lavish oriental locations going from steamy jungles and crowded ports to lively villages and ruined forts, bolstered by some rather effective action set-pieces, including a still pretty convincing storm-beset ship and several tense jungle and fort battles where Jim has to use his wits to make the most of limited weaponry against the general and his armed thugs. The cast likewise are no real slouch, with O'Toole capably straddling the lines of man of action and torn doubter, definitely echoing parts of his performance from Lawrence, while Eli Wallach easily gets to have the most fun as a villainous French general, while his performance strongly echoes his work on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He even has the same sneering, sweaty demeanor, and it's very, very effective and enjoyable to watch. It's really more squarely in the writing when the problems with Lord Jim come up. The film has a completely bungled first act that royally deflates the inciting incident of Jim's cowardice, mainly through the baffling decision to have lazy, info-dump narration fill us in on just about everything relating to Jim's backstory and most of his character traits, so you don't really get much time to invest or understand Jim or even see him in action before his life completely goes to hell, nor do you really care when he panics and makes a mistake that could have been fatal. Even that sequence is kind of hokey and presented in a sort of weird, dreamish kind of way. How Brooks, a man well-versed in character-centric drama, could get this fundamental tenet of storytelling so wrong is just really head-scratching. Was he afraid of losing some of Conrad's prose? This is thankfully balanced out in the second act as we see Jim battle his own demons while trying to be a hero to the oppressed locals. It also gives O'Toole a chance to play with more layers of Jim's character and his morality, as well as play off of Wallach's slimely general. There's a terrific little moment before the key battle when a Petusian girl, named Just Girl in this movie for whatever reason, chats with Jim about why he's doing what he's doing. For being a big spectacle, Lord Jim often works best in his quieter moments as we see Jim wrestle with questions over his valor and what he means to these people. And it does certainly help to give a bit more stakes and weight to the action scenes. However, then the third act rears its head and the film becomes really dragged out by introducing a secondary villain, played well by James Mason, who isn't terribly complex or threatening, and most of his banter with Jim about his bravery and what he truly is feels like it could have just been collapsed back into the main material with Wallach's general. Indeed, all of this passage serves to do is basically parrot what we've already heard, and lacks any real tension or stakes when you introduce someone substantially less threatening and powerful for Jim to battle against. While it does serve a character purpose for Jim to close out his arc, it feels really inefficient, clumsy, and needlessly padded for a film narrative, and instead serves more as a reminder of how films and novels differ in structure and pacing. Lord Jim's confusion between wanting to be more than a typical jungle actioner and even take on some of those lean-esque elements that examine notions of bravery, heroism, and the worth of a man may be the film's single biggest fault. Its deeper questions take a while to gain substance and then come off as perhaps a tad half-baked, and not as deep or meaningful as someone like Brooks could have pulled off. Though, all told, in the end, Lord Jim is by no means boring, having enough in its arsenal to trek on if you're in the mood for old-fashioned thrills. Starting weaker than it ends, it may not quite live up to Lawrence of Arabia's high standards, but it's far from being a bad adventure yarn in its own right, and one that is certainly not worth the dismal reception it got at the time. In fact, it's not hard to see why Peter O'Toole said that he had a soft spot for this film.